We're delighted to be jointly hosting this evening with the Royal Irish Academy. The Geographical Society of Ireland is over 90 years old, and we strive to represent professional geographers working in various roles and sectors in Ireland. We are very proud of our discipline, but we also embrace the value of engaging beyond our own boundaries, particularly given our broad and holistic interests. So tonight, together with the Geography and Geosciences Committee of the RIA, we chose our focus on curriculum. It is, of course, Geography Awareness Week, and this is one of the events, but I would say the flagship event for the week, and we're delighted so many people are joining here in person and online. But in particular, we want to look at curriculum tonight because of the various drafting and consultations around subjects over the last few years, and also with the piloting of the Climate Action and Sustainable Development Leaving Cert subject this year, which really brings our role to the fore, considering our history in understanding place-based transitions and responses to climate change and climate crises. And in particular, we have been very involved as a society, similarly mirroring the committee here in the RIA. We have been, I think, equally involved in many of the consultations and often collaborated with each other. I think we generally try to take a collaborative approach, which I think is always stronger if we work together. So it is with this in mind, we brought together our speaker and our panelists together. So I'm going to just introduce our keynote speaker initially, and then when Professor Kaplan is finished, I'll introduce you to all the panelists. So I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Kaplan, who is Professor of Geography at Kent State University, Ohio. His research interests include nationalism, borderlands, ethnic and racial segregation, urban and regional development, housing finance, and sustainable transportation. Dr. Kaplan is the past president from 2019 to 2020 of the American Association of Geographers, a slightly larger association than your equivalent here, but we'd like to think we're just as good proportionately. It is indeed the American Association of Geographers is the largest academic geography association in the Americas. Professor Kaplan is also chair of the AAG's Healthy Departments Committee. We are delighted to have him with us this evening to give the keynote address. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Karen. And thanks to all of you for inviting me over to this beautiful place. I've had a terrific couple of days just exploring Dublin in very, very cold temperatures, but I've been thankful that it hasn't rained. So I'm going to talk a little bit about American geography, and that's what I thought would be perhaps most appropriate, particularly when it comes to curricular issues. And I'm going to, at the behest of Karen and the committee, keep it relatively brief because I think some of these points might be brought out in the panel discussion. But I do want to give you my perspective and where I'm coming from, because I've always been an American geographer. At least I would consider myself having been professionally an American geographer for about 40 years. And during that time, I've been involved in one academic department or another. I've been involved, as Karen mentioned, at the what used to be the Association of American Geographers is now called the American Association of Geographers, which is a large body, but primarily a body made up of academic geographers. And I think that's an important consideration to make, is that you do not have a whole lot of teachers of geography, teachers who teach below the what we call the undergraduate level in that association. There may be one or two, but simply not the kind of organization for that. There's another organization that tends to be more attractive to people who teach geography. So there's already a division that's built in between that more academic, theoretical kind of AAG and the more teaching-oriented National Council for Geographical Education. And that's something that I think we've long had to contend with. Now, as luck would have it, I was president of the AAG at the absolute worst time, because I was president during the pandemic. And I would not wish being president during a pandemic on anyone. That's when we, for the first time ever, we actually had to cancel our annual meeting, which tends to draw about 10,000 people. And we just had to make it go completely virtual, which was really not the same. And so I did have a sense of what happens when an organization like that is under stress. But while I was president of the AAG, I did have a great deal of interest in, exactly what is the status of American geography? And I think in some ways we could talk about and extend that to the status of geography throughout the world. Well, the status of American geography is interesting. And maybe you'd find it interesting if you are not as familiar. One thing is that geography in the United States is a very marginal field. It's a big association. We have a lot of people who attend our annual meeting. In fact, we'll see what happens this year, but we have had a lot of people come from overseas to attend the annual meeting, and a lot of people from overseas who belong to the AAG. But in terms of American education, it is a fairly marginal discipline. I did a little research about 4 years ago, and there are approximately 5,000 students who graduate with a geography degree in the United States. That would be 1% of the total number of graduates. So that's a small number. Now, just to give you a little bit of context, I don't have the Irish figures, but one thing I did want to do when I came up with those numbers, I want to say, what's it like, say in the United Kingdom? That seemed to be the best comparison. And there it's more like 5% of all majors are geography. So already you're talking about the fact that in the US, it's just much more marginal. And what that means is that a lot of people have never really been exposed to geography. In fact, there are probably about 3,500, 4,000 institutions of higher education in the United States. Of those, possibly 300 or so have a geography program at all. So you've got about a 90% chance of not even being exposed to geography. And one thing, whenever they hire some new academic administrator from somewhere else, the first question I always ask is, did they come from a program with geography? Because if they did, maybe they have kind of a good opinion of us. But if they didn't, oh, God forbid, they don't know what it is. They might think it's, and this is something that really boils my blood, they might call it geology. And so that's the kind of thing that we have to contend with when we're talking about geography in the United States. But I think that, so if I was going to give this lecture, 20 years ago, I would be probably a lot more positive about what was happening with geography. That was kind of a high watermark. For one thing, there was a lot of support from really what is our biggest geographical organization, the National Geographical Society. Of course, everybody knows those little yellow magazines that most people have as like little bricks in their basement. At least in the United States, that's true. And the National Geographic Society had made it intention to try to bolster geography education in a very meaningful way. They sponsored a series of geographical alliances, for example, for every single state, which was meant to try to promote geography. They came up with a set of national standards, which again was meant to promote geography and make sure that every student would know certain aspects of geography, things like location and region and diffusion, stuff like that. Well, same time, we saw the promise of GIS, Geographic Information Sciences. Geospatial technologies were riding high. Everybody wanted a piece of those geospatial technologies, and no wonder why. You could draw a map without, with like just a little thimbleful of knowledge. You could make up a beautiful looking map. And so people were really interested in what geography had to offer, and geography enrollments were growing and growing, and it looked like we might actually be achieving some sort of like launch velocity, that we would go into the mainstream of disciplines, that no longer would we be confused with geology. In fact, we would have found our own. Alas, that was not to be. We hit our high water mark in about 2013 in terms of the numbers of students who were in geography. And since then, we have experienced a slow but steady decline. Now, a lot of that has to do with the overall decline in higher education numbers, at least in the United States. And I don't know how much that translates to other parts of the world. It probably does, certainly to Western Europe. We've had fewer students who are in that college category. And so there's that secular trend of fewer students who are maybe likely to pursue a college education. You also have in the United States fewer students who are eligible to pursue higher education who decide to do that, which may be a good thing, but in the same way, it does end up harming the overall numbers of people who are enrolled. And also, as you may have heard, the United States has become very politicized lately. And education is in the forefront of that politicization, right? In the sense that, you know, most people who are conservative, many people who are conservative in the United States have a lot of distrust for higher education. And so you see this sort of disjuncture between, say, Republicans or conservatives who are very distrustful of higher education, may not be so supportive of higher education, may not even decide to pursue higher education, and more liberal Democrats who tend to consider higher education, you know, essential. So this is a big difference. So that's been a trend that's happened for higher education as a whole. But I think geography has also been hit by some other things that have hurt it in particular. One thing is that, you know, the big promise of GIS, it was established and it has borne fruit, but GIS is increasingly not taught in geography programs. GIS is something that is more accessible to anyone. And so you can have a perfectly adequate GIS training without having to have a geography program. And in fact, we're finding more and more of that being the case. I think, again, you've had a lack of support among some of the main institutional actors. The National Geographical Society no longer supports geography in the way that it did. The entire company actually ended up being devolved into a bunch of other companies. And so we don't have geographical alliances anymore. We don't have a way in which geography can be supported at the state level. And so that's something that's also tended to hurt geography. And then there's the fact that there are other, and I'll get to this in a little bit, there are other sort of majors that have also become much more important. Things like environmental studies, which, you know, one could argue have tended to cannibalize geography in some ways, because it offers many of the same attributes that geography does, but it's much more attractive to many students. So these are the sorts of things that, you know, we have to think about. So geography enrollments have been declining, I think even more so than higher education enrollments. And one of our biggest concerns is how do we try to bring that back in some meaningful way? Now, I had an interesting discussion upstairs with folks here just about the nature of higher education in Ireland. And whenever I have these discussions, I'm always struck by how different it is in the United States. The United States, the higher education is a profoundly local kind of thing, right? We don't have a national higher education type of establishment. We do have a Department of Education, which I believe is going to be dismantled. At least that's what I saw in the news today. But higher education tends to be controlled largely by states. At least public higher education tends to be largely controlled by the states. And the same is true when it comes to K through 12, what we would call elementary school, middle school, high school. K through 12 education is also profoundly local, even more so than higher education is. Some standards are set by the states. The federal government does not set standards at all for K through 12 education. They may have a few things that impinge on it, but for the most part, it's the state that's going to establish these particular standards. And then the different localities, the different school districts are the ones that are there to carry it out. So a lot of the place of geography has to do with whether or not states are going to require students to take geography at that K through 12 level. And in fact, very few do. There are generally a number of requirements. History, for example, is required in almost every single state. Well, there are 51 states in the United States, because I'm counting the District of Columbia, which is its own little entity. Guess how many of them require geography? Three states require geography. And that's something that we've had to deal with. Now, that's a decline from a few years ago when I think there were something like 7. And even then, you couldn't really trust the kind of geography that was required. But it's just a burden, because if geography isn't required at the K through 12 level, it means that students are not going to have any exposure to it. And then chances are they're going to go to a college or university where geography isn't even on the menu. And so this becomes a big problem in terms of the overall visibility. Now, there are some countervailing things that have happened that are quite positive, at least in my opinion. One of these is that we have had an explosive growth of what we call AP Human Geography. I don't know how many of you are familiar with AP or advanced placement. Is anybody here familiar with advanced placement? A little bit, yeah. Advanced placement's an interesting concept. You know, many people would bemoan the level of education in high schools. It's not rigorous enough. You know, people are just socially promoted. You know, everybody passes no matter how weak their how weak their tests are or anything like that. Well, advanced placement is intended as a way to provide those students who really do want to learn more and have, you know, a level of rigor and ability to take a very high level class, a college level class, and then take a test that will then allow them to earn college credit later on. And so there are about 30 advanced placement subjects in the United States. Now, this is something, as with many things in the United States, it depends on how wealthy your school district is. And did I tell you that the level of your school district has a lot to do with how wealthy it is, right? So if you are in a posh suburb somewhere, you may find that you have 25 AP classes that are offered in everything from biology to chemistry to government to English to calculus to statistics and on and on and on and on and on. If you're in a poor district, which could be in the inner city or maybe in a rural area, you may have none. So a lot of this depends on where you end up going to school, how wealthy your district is. But AP has been a way in which a number of students have been able to get exposure to these college level subjects and then take a test later on. And if they pass that test or get a certain number on that test, then they're eligible for credit at any university at all. Now with AP, they introduced human geography back in about 2020. About 25 years ago, they introduced AP Human Geography. And lo and behold, AP Human Geography is the fastest growing AP subject in the United States. You know, back when it started, of course, there were just a few thousand. Even in 2015, there was something like 114,000. But you know what there was in 2025? There were 282,000 students who took AP Human Geography. 282,000 students who took this class, who took the exam. So you don't have to take the class to take the exam, but generally speaking, it's a good idea. So you've got this explosive growth. It's the fastest growing AP subject. It is the 9th most popular AP subject, exceeded by some subjects like English or government or things like that. But that's fantastic. Another thing that's fantastic is we also have another way. So it's funny how the United States, they're coming up with all these fixes for the fact that the education system is really crappy. So AP is one of them. Another one is called dual enrollment, which is another interesting twist that you may not have heard of. That's where students have the opportunity, paid for by the state or by the local school district, to take a class at a local college or university. They take that class and they receive college credit, and they also receive high school credit for taking that class. You've probably never heard of anything like that, but there are over 2.5 million students every year who take dual enrollment classes. So you could have an opportunity there as well to take a geography class. So these are things that are good, but there's also things that people worry about. So it's kind of a cross-pressured thing. So people worry, for example, if you take AP Human Geography in high school, well, maybe you're not going to take that in college. And human geography is a big subject among geography departments at the university level. If you take a dual enrollment class, again, you may not pursue that in college. And there have not been very good ways in which we have leveraged that growth in AP Human Geography and in dual enrollment into students coming into universities and taking a geography major. So this is the kind of issues that we have to contend with. On one hand, we do have this amazing gift, the fact that we do have AP Human Geography and we do have students who may be exposed to geography, but we have not borne out any fruit in terms of being able to leverage that and turn that into geography majors, at least not yet. And I know as president, I wrote a column on that and wondered how we can do that. And the current president, Bill Moseley, I think is very, very concerned about this particular aspect of trying to make sure that AP Human Geography can turn itself into more and more geography majors. So, I mean, I talk about, you know, anyone who deals with geography, and here I'm preaching to the choir. Of course, we all know about all of geography's strengths, right? And I'm not going to really go into those because you wouldn't be here if you didn't agree with me that geography is just a kick-ass discipline that everybody ought to take it and take even more and more and more of it. The interdisciplinarity of it, the fact that, you know, you have a great deal of geospatial knowledge that comes out of it. The fact that when you're looking at geographers, they tend to have a very nice synthetic view of things. They know all different kinds of things in all different kinds of places. That there's that attention to scale that a lot of people just aren't nearly as aware of. I mean, there's so many aspects of the world that are so much more understandable when you deal with geography. You know, and I think particularly a human environment, that being so important, the fact that so many things, it doesn't just have to do with the natural environment, or just the human aspect or the human society, it has to do with the interplay of both of those things, which is geographers, that's just second nature. Of course we know that, but a lot of other people really don't. The thing is that I believe that a lot of other majors that have emerged tend to steal a little bit of that thunder. I mentioned before environmental studies, and I've got a lot of affection for environmental studies. In fact, I started environmental studies at my institution. I started the major and I direct it even now. And wouldn't you know it, environmental studies is just a much more attractive major than geography. In my department, we have about 220 students who major in environmental studies, and we have about 35 who major in geography. Now, I don't think that all of those environmental studies majors would have been geographers. In fact, I think most of them are new people, but it just goes to show you that you can have a major like that, an interdisciplinary major that can take away some of what makes geography special. Not all of it, but at least some of it. And this is happening across the country. I was just talking to a colleague of mine in California, and she said that, you know, geography just did not have the number of majors necessary for it to survive, but they were going to double down on environmental studies. So rather than having a Department of Geography with an environmental studies program, they're going to have a Department of Environmental Studies with no geography program. And this is happening in many places. And as, you know, on one hand, I'm thinking, well, yeah. But on the other hand, I'm thinking this is kind of sad because environmental studies is not geography. It has a very different type of, you know, genesis. It has different sensibilities. And honestly, as Karen so kindly mentioned, my studies in things like nationalism really don't fit that well into environmental studies. So it's going to take away so much of what human geographers do and probably other aspects of geography as well. So this is something that I think we have had to contend with. Another aspect is, say, global studies, which is also a very popular major in some circles. That can take away much of geography's focus on things like places and regions. So again, these can be ideas, these can be popular alternatives, but they're also dangerous in some ways in that we could take away the essence of what makes geography strong and leave it as much more of a hollow shell without any sort of student involvement. And that's something that I worry about. Well, you know, beyond the sort of the, I guess, organic threats to geography, of course, we've had some political threats, not surprisingly. And in the US, we've had certain developments that I think cut to the core of what a lot of geographers do. You may have heard we had a change in administration, and that administration was very much against pretty much everything, but anything that geographers maybe would do, you know, so certainly against climate change, you know, study, against anything that involves diversity, against really any sort of, I think, you know, any sort of accumulation of knowledge. And so we've had these sorts of, you know, and against a lot of foreign students, a lot of international students, which is something that we've worked with. So this has had a profound effect on geography in the sense that so much of the funding of American geography has been affected by the fact that, you know, many grants are no longer possible to get. You can't get the kind of money for climate change research you used to be able to get. If you're involved in anything related to ethnic or racial diversity, those grants were canceled. In fact, I have a former student of mine who got a very nice 5-year NSF grant to study minorities in rural areas, and that grant was simply canceled. This happened all over the place. So many of the people who were involved in this type of things were geographers, and they ended up getting their funding canceled. So that's been a threat just in terms of what has happened to the sorts of topics that geographers like to study. There's also been a huge set of state level threats. And again, America is very federal. You have 51 different units that are involved, and they all have different political leanings. But it so happens that a lot of the distrust of higher education by conservatives can be translated into legislation. And so I happen to live in a state in Ohio, which has become fairly conservative in the last few years. And they just passed a bill that puts a lot of restrictions on higher education as a whole, and also has restrictions that are going to have relevance to geography. Several of the things have to do with anti-diversity, so we're in a position where we have to remove all of our diversity requirements, which geography has very heavily been participating in. But there are also other things like caps on the number of students that you can have. So, or actually a minimum levels of the number of students that you can have. So if you have enrollments below a certain number, it's mandated that those programs be cut. And of course, geography, being a little bit more on the edge, has had to contend with low enrollment programs and having to eliminate many of those low enrollment programs. So we've had to deal with that. And this has happened over the last few years, but it's really come to a head in the last year or so, having to deal with all of these threats to higher education, but specifically to geography. And so we're in a position now of trying to figure out, how do we show our value? How do we kind of come out from there? And of course, we all know the value of geography, but I think it's important to keep in mind, how are we going to leverage that value in a particular way? Geography has certain aspects that I think render it very special among disciplines. I think it's the one discipline that, if done right, it teaches students literacy, it teaches them numeracy, it teaches them graphicacy in a way that students in any other discipline simply can't get. It's a very integrative discipline. Students end up learning a lot of different types of domain knowledge that they can use. Students who come out of geography programs tend to be very savvy about geospatial technologies. And I know many of my students have leveraged that into really good jobs. So geography has a good job placement record. We all know that. But we need to figure out, how do we make those things press, and how do we take some of the advantage that we have and try to make geography a stronger place. And so I was trying to think of some lessons from this little talk. And I guess I have a few. I guess the main thing I would say, and this is probably true here as it is in the United States, is we really just have to mind our P's and our Q's. We have to make sure we do everything possible to increase the number of students who are involved in geography, to increase our major numbers, to make our major more attractive to people. We can't have all these like nasty fights within a department. We can't start ignoring the students, who really are the lifeblood of geography. Without the students, we will not have geography programs anywhere. We have to be flexible. We have to open ourselves up to other possibilities. I mentioned this sort of double-edged sword of something like environmental studies. Well, on one hand, it can be a positive, but we have to be very careful with that. We certainly have to work to increase our involvement with K through 12 education, particularly those places that are offering AP Human Geography. Very, very few colleges or universities do anything like that. They don't have programs that try to, connect with the high schools. And that's even true of my own town. We have AP Human Geography. We have a geography program. There is no connection between the two of those. And this is true across the country, and we have to just do a much better job of that. We have to promote our core competencies, right? We have to show people this is what we do and this is how we have the value. And we always have to be aware that geography is an incredibly important discipline, but that maintaining it is always going to be an uphill struggle. We have to rise to that challenge. So thank you very much.